The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that made the air feel thick, heavy, and dangerous. Everyone's eyes were locked on the tiny boy sitting in the witness stand. His small fingers gripped the edge of the wooden seat, his feet dangling above the floor. His face was pale, his big brown eyes darting nervously between the judge, the jury, and the woman sitting across the room. His mother. She was staring at him too, her eyes filled with something between fear and pleading. She shook her head ever so slightly, almost unnoticeable, as if begging him not to say what he was about to say. "Can you tell the court what you saw that night?" the lawyer asked gently, stepping closer to the boy. The boy swallowed hard. His little hands trembled. His heart pounded like a drum. He turned his head slightly, looking at his mother once again. She was crying now. Silent tears ran down her face, but she didn't say a word. He turned back to the lawyer. His lips quivered, but then, in a voice so small yet so powerful, he said, "I saw her do it. I saw my mom kill him." Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge's gavel slammed down. His mother's head fell into her hands as she sobbed uncontrollably. The jury looked stunned. No one expected this. No one. And then, months before that shocking moment, the boy, Daniel, was just like any other 7-year-old. He loved superheroes, dinosaurs, and peanut butter sandwiches. He had a missing front tooth and a favorite stuffed lion named Rory. He lived with his mother, Lisa, in a small apartment on the east side of town. His father wasn't around. In fact, Daniel had never met him. Lisa never talked about him. It was just the two of them, and for the most part, life was okay. Lisa worked long hours at the diner, and sometimes she came home late and tired. But she always made sure Daniel had food, a warm bed, and bedtime stories. She loved him. He knew that. But things started to change. It began with the man who showed up one night. A man Daniel had never seen before. He was tall, with cold eyes and a deep voice that made Daniel's skin crawl. His name was Victor, and from the moment he walked into their lives, nothing was the same. At first, Victor was just a guest. He visited sometimes, bringing Lisa flowers and whispering things in her ear that made her blush. But soon, his visits became more frequent. Then, one night, he never left. Victor wasn't like the friendly neighbors Daniel was used to. He didn't play with him. He barely even looked at him. And when he did, his gaze felt sharp, like a knife. Daniel noticed how his mom started acting differently. She was quieter, more nervous. She didn't smile as much. Some nights, Daniel could hear voices through the walls, angry voices. Victor yelling, Lisa crying. Then came the bruises. Lisa always had an excuse. "I fell in the kitchen," she'd say. Or, "I bumped into the door." But Daniel wasn't stupid. He knew something was wrong. One night, everything exploded. Daniel had been in his room, tucked under his blanket with Rory, listening to the sound of rain tapping against the window. Then, suddenly, crash. The sound of glass shattering. His mother screamed. Daniel's heart jumped into his throat. He bolted upright, his tiny hands gripping the sheets. Another crash. More screaming. He ran out of his room, his bare feet padding against the cold floor. What he saw in the living room made his blood turn to ice. Victor had his mother by the arm, his grip so tight that her skin was turning red. Her face was covered in tears, and her lower lip was bleeding. A broken vase lay in pieces on the floor. "Please, Victor, stop," Lisa begged, her voice shaky. But Victor didn't stop. His other hand was clenched into a fist, and before Daniel could even process what was happening, he hit her. Hard. Lisa collapsed onto the floor, clutching her cheek. Daniel screamed. Victor's eyes snapped to him. For the first time, the man truly looked at Daniel. His eyes were full of something dark, something evil. "Go back to your room," Victor ordered, his voice thick with anger. But Daniel didn't move. He was frozen, terrified. Lisa, still on the floor, looked at her son. Her eyes were wide, pleading. "Daniel, sweetie, go, please." Daniel shook his head, tears forming in his eyes. "No, I don't want to," Victor growled under his breath, stepping toward Daniel. And then Lisa moved. Fast. She grabbed something from the floor. a sharp piece of the broken vase. Before Victor could react, she swung it straight into his neck. A horrible choking sound filled the room. Victor stumbled back, his hands flying to his throat. Blood gushed between his fingers. His eyes widened in shock, then in horror. He gasped, staggered, then fell to the ground with a heavy thud. Silence. Only the sound of Lisa's heavy breathing filled the air. Her hands were covered in red. Her face was pale as a ghost. Daniel stood frozen, unable to believe what he had just seen. His mother had just killed a man. Lisa dropped the bloody shard. She turned to her son, her lips trembling. "Daniel," she whispered. "Baby, listen to me. We have to be smart about this. We have to." But before she could finish, bang, 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 a loud pounding at the door. "Police, open up." Lisa's face drained of color. Daniel's tiny heart pounded as flashing red and blue lights flooded through the window. And just like that, everything changed. The pounding on the door was deafening. "Police, open up." Lisa's breath came in sharp gasps. Her hands, still stained with Victor's blood, trembled as she clutched Daniel's tiny shoulders. "Listen to me," she whispered urgently, her eyes wild with panic. "Say nothing. Do you hear me?" "Nothing." Daniel couldn't speak. His mouth felt dry. His heart pounded so hard in his chest that he thought it might burst. He could barely process what had just happened, what he had just seen. Victor was dead. His mother had killed him. More banging. Last warning. "Open the door now." Lisa jumped up, wiping her hands on her shirt. She grabbed Daniel's arm, dragging him toward the hallway. "Hide," she whispered fiercely. "Go into your room and stay quiet. Don't come out, no matter what." Daniel hesitated, but the sheer fear in his mother's eyes forced his legs to move. He turned and ran, his bare feet slapping against the cold floor as he slipped into his room, shutting the door behind him. He pressed his ear against the wood, his little body shaking. The front door burst open with a loud crack. Down on the ground, a voice shouted. Daniel heard his mother scream. Heavy footsteps thundered through the apartment. Daniel flinched as he heard the sounds of a struggle, furniture scraping, more shouting. Then thud. A body hitting the floor. Silence. Then voices again. "She's out cold. Cuff her." Daniel's chest tightened. His hands covered his mouth to stop a sob from escaping. He heard the rustling of handcuffs, the crackle of a police radio, then the sound of someone speaking. "There's a kid here," a deep voice said. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. "Find him." The door creaked open, light from the hallway spilling into the room. Daniel curled into himself under the bed, holding his breath. He willed himself to become invisible, to disappear into the darkness. Soft footsteps approached. Then a voice, gentler than the others. "Hey, buddy," the man said. "You can come out now. It's okay." Daniel didn't move. A sigh. Then the officer crouched down, and a pair of kind brown eyes met his. "We're not going to hurt you," the man said softly. "We just want to help." Daniel's lips quivered. I want my mom," he whispered. The officer hesitated, his face shadowed with something Daniel didn't understand. "Come on, kid," he said finally. "Let's get you out of here." Daniel didn't resist as strong arms lifted him out from under the bed. He clutched Rory tightly to his chest, his tiny body trembling. As they carried him out, he saw his mother lying on the floor, her hands cuffed behind her back. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused. "Mama!" Daniel cried, reaching for her. Lisa's eyes locked onto his, and she struggled against the cuffs. "Let him go. Please, he's just a kid," she sobbed. The officers pulled Daniel away. Lisa's screams echoed through the apartment as they took her. And just like that, Daniel's world shattered. The police station smelled strange, like old paper and something bitter that stung Daniel's nose. He sat in a small, cold room with a cup of water in front of him. His hands gripped Rory so tightly that his knuckles were white. A woman with soft blonde hair and kind eyes sat across from him. "My name is Detective Monroe," she said gently. "Do you know why you're here, sweetheart?" Daniel shook his head. He felt like if he spoke, he might cry. Detective Monroe gave him a sad smile. "We just need to know what happened tonight. she said. Daniel didn't answer. She sighed. Daniel, your mom is in a lot of trouble, but we want to help her. We just need the truth. Can you tell us what you saw? He swallowed hard. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Say nothing. Detective Monroe leaned in closer. Did your mom hurt that man, Daniel? Daniel's lip trembled. He looked down at Rory, his fingers stroking the stuffed lion's mane. I don't know, he whispered. Detective Monroe nodded slowly, watching him carefully. Okay, she said. You must be very tired. Would you like to rest for a little while? Daniel just nodded. All right. We'll take you somewhere safe for the night, okay? But Daniel didn't want to go anywhere safe. He wanted to go home. They took him to a strange house. It wasn't like his home. There were toys, a warm bed, even cookies on a plate waiting for him. But it wasn't his home. A woman named Mrs. Carter told him he could call her Auntie Jo. She had a warm smile, but Daniel didn't want her smile. He wanted his mother. That night, he cried into Rory's fur, the image of his mother's tear-streaked face haunting him. What was going to happen to her? Would he ever see her again? The next few weeks were a blur. Daniel met with social workers, detectives, and lawyers. Everyone kept asking him the same questions. Did you see your mother kill Victor? Was it self-defense? Was Victor hurting your mother? Daniel didn't know what to say. His mother had told him to say nothing, but the truth was burning inside him. Finally, one day, Auntie Jo sat him down. Daniel, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You have to testify. Daniel frowned. What's testify? It means you have to tell the court what happened. Daniel's stomach twisted into a tight knot. But what if I don't want to? Auntie Jo sighed, smoothing his messy hair. I know this is scary, but if you don't speak, they might think your mom did something very bad, and they might take her away forever. Daniel's chest tightened. Forever? Auntie Jo nodded. Daniel clutched Rory. He didn't want to lose his mom, but if he told the truth, what if they still took her away? Days passed, then weeks, until one day, the court date arrived, and suddenly, Daniel found himself sitting in that cold courtroom, surrounded by strangers in fancy suits. His mother sat across the room. Her eyes found his, full of tears. Then, a man in a suit stood. We called Daniel Carter to the stand. The courtroom murmured. Daniel felt frozen. Auntie Jo squeezed his shoulder. It's okay, sweetheart. Just be brave. With shaky legs, Daniel climbed onto the chair in the witness stand. The judge looked at him kindly. Hello, young man, he said. Do you know why you're here today? Daniel nodded slowly. Good. Now, tell us, Daniel, what happened that night? Daniel's throat felt dry. He could hear his own heartbeat. Then he looked at his mother, and he told them. I saw her do it, Daniel said softly. Gasps filled the courtroom. Lisa let out a choked sob, her head falling into her hands. The jury's faces were pale. The judge looked stunned. And just like that, Daniel's words changed everything. The courtroom was no longer silent. People whispered, shifting in their seats. The judge rubbed his forehead. The prosecutor, a tall man in a dark suit, glanced at his papers as if making sure he had just heard Daniel correctly. But the loudest sound of all was Lisa's quiet sobs. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her face was buried in her hands, shaking. Daniel felt like he couldn't breathe. He had done something terrible. He had told the truth, just like everyone wanted. So why did it feel so wrong? The prosecutor cleared his throat and took a step closer to Daniel. Daniel, he said in a slow, careful voice, can you explain to the court exactly what you saw that night? Daniel swallowed hard. His tiny hands gripped the armrests of the chair. He looked down at his feet, dangling above the ground, and wished he could disappear. His voice came out small, weak. I was in my room. I heard something break. The prosecutor nodded. Go on. Daniel sniffled. His whole body felt cold. I ran out and Victor was hurting my mom. His voice cracked. He hit her. Lisa let out a quiet sob from across the room. The prosecutor frowned. And then what happened? Daniel's lip trembled. My mom. She grabbed something from the floor. A pause. What did she grab, Daniel? He hesitated. He didn't want to say it. He wanted to run out of the courtroom and hide. But the whole room was watching him. The jury, the judge, the men with the notebooks. My mom grabbed a piece of the broken vase, Daniel whispered, and she stabbed him. Another wave of gasps swept through the courtroom. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He didn't want to cry. He had to be strong. But his chest felt so tight, like it was full of rocks. The prosecutor nodded slowly. He glanced at Lisa before turning back to Daniel. Did your mother say anything to you after it happened? Daniel hesitated. He remembered his mother's face, the way her voice had shaken. Baby, listen to me. We have to be smart about this. He looked up at her now. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with tears. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. She told me to say nothing. Lisa let out a choked sound, almost like a gasp. Her whole body slumped forward, as if someone had just hit her in the stomach. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge pounded his gavel. Order in the court, he said firmly. Daniel's hands were shaking. He felt dizzy. His head spun like he was on a ride that wouldn't stop. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, no further questions. Daniel felt a rush of relief. It was over. Or at least, he thought it was. Because the next voice that spoke was sharp, strong. Defense may cross-examine the witness. Lisa's lawyer, a woman with dark hair tied in a bun, stood up. She walked toward Daniel, her heels clicking against the floor. She knelt in front of him so that their eyes were level. Hi, Daniel, she said softly. My name is Ms. Reynolds. I just want to ask you a few questions, okay? Daniel nodded slowly, but his stomach twisted. Ms. Reynolds smiled gently. Sweetheart, I know this is scary, but I want you to tell the truth, okay? The whole truth. Daniel swallowed. He didn't understand what she meant. Hadn't he already told the truth? Ms. Reynolds stood and turned to the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard young Daniel say something very important today. He said his mother stabbed Victor. Yes. But before that, what did he say? She turned back to Daniel. Daniel, you said you saw Victor hurting your mother. Is that right? Daniel nodded. What exactly was Victor doing? Daniel's throat felt dry. He grabbed her arm. He was squeezing it really hard. And then, he hit her. The courtroom whispered again. Ms. Reynolds nodded. Daniel, was this the first time Victor hurt your mom? Daniel hesitated. Then, slowly, he shook his head. Lisa's head snapped up. Her eyes were wide, full of shock. Ms. Reynolds nodded. How many times did Victor hurt her? Daniel bit his lip. He didn't want to think about it, but he remembered the bruises, the excuses, the nights he had heard his mother crying in her room. A lot, he whispered. Ms. Reynolds turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit B, medical reports from the hospital showing multiple bruises, fractures, and other injuries Lisa Carter suffered during her time with Victor Garrison. The judge nodded. Proceed. The prosecutor stood. Objection, Your Honor. That doesn't change the fact that she killed him. Ms. Reynolds turned sharply. It does change the fact that she was a victim of domestic abuse. The room fell silent. Ms. Reynolds turned back to Daniel. Daniel, one last question. He looked up at her, feeling small, afraid. She knelt again, her voice softer now. Daniel, do you believe your mom was trying to protect herself that night? Daniel blinked. He thought about the fear in his mother's eyes. The way Victor had looked at him, at her, as if they were nothing. He thought about the blood. The way his mother had held him afterward, whispering, It's okay, baby. It's over. His voice was barely a breath. Yes. Ms. Reynolds stood. No further questions, Your Honor. Daniel sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, his hands gripping Rory. He had done it. He had told the truth. But was it enough? Auntie Jo sat beside him, rubbing his back gently. You were so brave, sweetheart. Daniel didn't feel brave. He felt tired, sad. Just then, the doors to the courtroom opened, and the lawyers stepped out, talking in hushed voices. His mother was led past him by the officers, her wrists still in handcuffs. Lisa stopped for a moment, turning to look at him. Her eyes were full of something Daniel had never seen before. Hope. She gave him a small smile, her lips trembling. I love you, Baby, she whispered. Daniel felt his chest tighten. I love you too, Mama, he whispered back. The officers led her away. Auntie Joe squeezed his shoulder. It's not over yet, sweetheart, she said. But you did the right thing. Daniel nodded. He wasn't sure what would happen next. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something else besides fear. He felt a tiny flicker of hope. The days after the trial felt like a blur. Daniel was back at Auntie Joe's house, but it didn't feel like home. Nothing did. His mother was still in jail, and every time he asked when he could see her, all he got were quiet sighs and sad looks. He hated it. He hated the quiet. He hated the way everyone spoke to him like he was made of glass, like he might shatter if they said the wrong thing. But most of all, he hated that no one had told him what was going to happen to his mother. Would she come home? Would he ever live with her again? No one had answers. Until one day, when Auntie Joe sat him down at the kitchen table. Daniel, sweetheart, there's something important we need to talk about, she said gently, pushing a warm mug of hot chocolate in front of him. Daniel's stomach twisted. He had heard that voice before. The soft, careful voice grown-ups used when they were about to say something bad. He didn't touch the hot chocolate. What? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Auntie Joe hesitated, exchanging a glance with the social worker sitting beside her. Her name was Miss Franklin, and she always wore the same red glasses and smelled like lemons. Daniel didn't like her much, not because she was mean, but because every time she came, she talked about things he didn't want to hear, like new homes and new families, and how these things take time. Miss Franklin cleared her throat. Daniel, your mother's case is still being decided by the court, she said carefully. But there's a chance she won't be able to take care of you for a very long time. Daniel's hands clenched into fists under the table. No, he said quickly. That's not true. Auntie Joe reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Sweetheart, listen. No. His voice cracked. His chest felt tight, his vision blurry. She didn't do anything wrong. She was just trying to protect us. Miss Franklin sighed. I know this is hard, Daniel, but the law doesn't always see things the way we do. Daniel jumped up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I don't care about the law, he shouted. I just want my mom. Tears burned his eyes, but he refused to cry. Auntie Joe stood up, reaching for him, but Daniel turned and ran. He didn't stop until he was in his room, slamming the door shut. He threw himself onto the bed, hugging Rory so tightly that his fingers hurt. This wasn't fair. None of it was fair. His mother wasn't a bad person. So why did it feel like the whole world wanted to take her away from him? That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of Auntie Joe moving around the house. And then, he made a decision. If no one was going to help his mom, then he would. The next morning, Daniel woke up early. He had a plan. Sort of. Okay, maybe it wasn't really a plan, but he knew one thing. He had to get to his mom. He had to tell the judge that she wasn't a bad person, that she didn't deserve to be in jail. And if no one was going to take him there, then he'd go himself. Sneaking out of Auntie Joe's house wasn't easy. She always woke up early, and the front door had a loud, squeaky lock. So Daniel waited. He stayed in his room, pretending to be asleep, listening to the sounds of the house. At exactly 9:30 a.m., Auntie Joe left for the grocery store. Miss Franklin was supposed to come check on him later, but that gave him at least an hour. An hour was all he needed. Daniel grabbed his backpack and stuffed Rory inside. Then he tiptoed to the front door, wincing at every tiny creak of the floorboards. He took a deep breath, turned the lock very slowly, and creak. He froze. Silence. His heart pounded. Then, after a few seconds of nothing, he pushed the door open and slipped outside. The city felt huge compared to Auntie Joe's quiet little neighborhood. Daniel had never walked this far alone before, but he had to keep going. His mom was at the county jail. He had heard Auntie Joe talking about it on the phone. He didn't know exactly where it was, but he had an idea, and he was going to find it, no matter what. An hour later, Daniel was lost. His feet hurt, his stomach growled, and everything looked the same. Big buildings, loud cars, too many people. He had asked a few grown-ups for directions, but most of them just gave him weird looks and kept walking. One old lady had tried to stop him and ask if he was lost, but Daniel ran before she could grab him. He didn't want help. He just wanted his mom. But now, standing on a busy street corner, he felt his first real wave of fear. What if he couldn't find her? What if he never saw her again? A lump formed in his throat, but he swallowed it down. No, he had to keep going. Then, screech. A car swerved sharply onto the sidewalk, tires skidding against the pavement. Daniel jumped back just in time. The car stopped inches away from where he had been standing. The door flew open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and had a sharp, serious face. Daniel's stomach twisted. Something about him felt wrong. The man's eyes locked onto him. "You lost, kid?" he asked. Daniel took a step back. And no. The man tilted his head. He looked Daniel up and down, and something in his expression changed, like he had recognized him. A slow, creepy smile spread across his face. Well, the man said softly. "You're Lisa Carter's boy, aren't you?" Daniel's blood ran cold. How did this man know his mother? Before he could move, the man stepped closer, his grip tightening around the car door. "I think we should have a little talk," he said. Daniel's heart pounded. Run. That was the only thought in his head. Run. But before he could, the man lunged. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The man moved fast, too fast. Before Daniel could react, the man grabbed his arm, his grip like iron. "Let me go," Daniel shouted, struggling. People were walking past, cars zooming by, but no one noticed. No one saw. The man crouched slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Daniel's. "Listen, kid," he said in a low voice. "I don't want to hurt you, but you're coming with me." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. "No," he yelled, kicking his legs, trying to twist out of the man's grip. The man sighed, tightening his hold. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Daniel's mind screamed at him to do something. So he did. He opened his mouth and bit down on the man's hand, hard. The man let out a sharp curse, yanking his hand away. That was all Daniel needed. He ripped free and ran. His legs pumped as fast as they could, his lungs burning. "Hey, get back here," the man shouted. Daniel didn't look back. He darted between people, weaving through the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could still hear the man behind him, his heavy footsteps pounding against the pavement. Faster, faster. Daniel turned a corner, nearly colliding with a woman carrying a shopping bag. "Whoa, slow down, kid." But he was already gone. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Then, up ahead, he saw it. A police station. His chest clenched. He didn't trust the police, not after they took his mom. But right now, they were his only chance. He sprinted toward the doors, his legs burning, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Just a little more. A hand clamped down on his shoulder. Daniel let out a terrified scream. The man spun him around, his face twisted with frustration. "Enough of this," he snapped. Daniel thrashed, kicking, clawing, trying to break free. And then, "Hey, let him go." A loud voice cut through the air. The grip on Daniel loosened for just a second. That was all it took. Daniel yanked himself away and ran straight into the police station. The inside of the station was cold and bright, filled with uniformed officers and ringing phones. Daniel burst through the doors, panting, his whole body shaking. An officer at the front desk blinked in surprise. "Hey, kid, you okay?" Daniel turned to look behind him. The man, he was gone, vanished, like he had never been there at all. But Daniel knew what he had seen. And worse, he knew that man had been looking for him. A few minutes later, Daniel was sitting in a chair, gripping Rory so tightly his fingers hurt. A female officer knelt in front of him. "Sweetie, can you tell me what happened?" Daniel swallowed. His throat was dry. His heart still felt like it was going to explode. "There was a man," he whispered. "He tried to take me." The officer's eyes narrowed. "What did he look like?" Daniel described him. Dark clothes, sharp face, creepy smile. The officer nodded, scribbling something in a notepad. "And do you know who he was?" Daniel shook his head. "No, but he knew my mom." The officer's pin stopped moving. Daniel gripped Rory even tighter. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "I just want to see my mom." The officer gave him a sad look. "We'll see what we can do." Daniel sat in the police station for what felt like forever. He sipped the juice box an officer had given him, but he didn't feel hungry. All he could think about was his mom. And the man. Who was he? And why did he want Daniel? Something about it felt wrong. Like there was a bigger piece of the puzzle he wasn't seeing. Then, finally, the officer returned. "Daniel," she said gently, "we're going to take you to see your mom." Daniel's heart leaped. But the officer's face was serious. "There's something you need to know first." Daniel's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. The drive to the jail felt like an eternity. Daniel sat in the back of the police car, his fingers twisting in his lap. The officer driving didn't say much. Finally, the car pulled into the parking lot of the county jail. Daniel's hands felt sweaty. Would his mom be okay? Would she be mad at him for testifying? The officer led him inside. And then, Daniel saw her. Lisa was sitting behind a thick glass window, wearing an orange jumpsuit. She looked smaller. Her eyes were tired, her hands fidgeting on the table. But when she saw Daniel, her face lit up. "Baby!" Daniel rushed forward, pressing his hands against the glass. "Mama!" Tears filled Lisa's eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, I've missed you so much." Daniel sniffled. "I missed you too." She placed her hand against the glass. He did the same. For a moment, everything felt okay. Then, Lisa's face darkened. "Daniel, listen to me," she said, her voice urgent. "You have to be careful." Daniel blinked. "What?" Lisa glanced around, lowering her voice. "Did anyone follow you here?" Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "The man," he whispered. "He tried to grab me." Lisa's face went pale. Her fingers curled into fists. "No, not him. Not again." Daniel's chest tightened. "Mama, who was he?" Lisa hesitated. Then, her voice came out small. "He's your father." Daniel's whole body went numb. The air in the room felt too thick, too heavy. His father? The man who had tried to grab him. The man with the cold eyes and creepy smile. Was his father? "No," Daniel whispered, shaking his head. "That's not true." Lisa's lips trembled. "Baby, I didn't want you to ever meet him. I wanted to keep you safe." Daniel's heart pounded. He thought about the way the man had looked at him. Like he knew him. Like he had been looking for him. The puzzle pieces started clicking together in his mind. The reason his mother never talked about his dad. The reason she looked so afraid when Victor started coming around. The reason the man knew his name before Daniel had ever seen him. Tears burned his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" Lisa swallowed hard. "Because he's dangerous, Daniel. He always has been." Daniel's chest tightened. His hands curled into fists. Dangerous. That word made his stomach twist. Because now he knew, this wasn't just about his mother's trial. This wasn't just about Victor. His father wanted something. And Daniel had a terrible feeling he knew exactly what it was. Lisa leaned forward, her eyes locked on Daniel's. "Sweetheart, you have to listen to me very carefully," Daniel sniffled, wiping his nose with the sleeve of his hoodie. "Okay." Lisa took a shaky breath. "You can't trust him. Ever." Daniel frowned. "But why? What does he want?" Lisa's jaw tightened. "You." Daniel's breath hitched. A heavy silence hung in the air. Lisa's hands trembled as she spoke. "Before you were born, I was with him. I thought he loved me. But he wasn't a good man, Daniel. He did terrible things. And when I got pregnant, he wanted to take you." Daniel's whole body tensed. Lisa's voice cracked. "I ran. I left everything behind to keep you safe. But he never stopped looking for us." Daniel felt like he couldn't breathe. His father had been looking for him? For years? Lisa's eyes were full of something Daniel had never seen before. Pure, raw fear. And then she whispered the words that made his blood turn to ice. "He won't stop, Daniel. Not until he gets what he wants." Daniel didn't speak the whole ride back to Annie Joe's house. His mind was spinning. His father had found him. And now, he knew where Daniel was. The police had said they would look into it. But Daniel wasn't stupid. The police hadn't helped his mom. Why would they help him now? His fingers curled around Rory's mane as he stared out the car window. He had a bad feeling, the worst feeling in the world. Something was coming, and he had to be ready. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the house. His father was out there, watching, waiting. His heart pounded. What if he came back? What if he tried to grab him again? What if this time, no one stopped him? Daniel turned to Rory, squeezing him tight. "What do I do?" he whispered. Of course, Rory didn't answer. But in his heart, Daniel knew what he had to do. He had to run, just like his mother had done all those years ago. Daniel packed his backpack quietly. He grabbed his hoodie, his sneakers, a water bottle, and some snacks from the kitchen. Then, as softly as possible, he pushed open the window. The cold night air rushed in, making him shiver. He climbed onto the windowsill, his heart pounding. Then, he jumped. His feet hit the grass with a soft thud. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the dark street. No turning back now. He took a deep breath, then started running. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away. Daniel had been running for almost an hour when he heard it. A car, moving slowly, too slowly. His chest tightened. He ducked into the shadows of a bus stop, his breath coming in sharp, quick gasps. The car rolled past. Dark windows, tinted. Then, it stopped. Daniel's blood turned to ice. The back door opened. A pair of black boots stepped onto the pavement. Daniel's heart pounded so hard it hurt. Then, that voice. Calm, smooth, wrong. "Come on out, Daniel." His father. Daniel's stomach dropped. His hands gripped Rory so tight that his fingers ached. His father took a slow step forward. "I know you're scared," he said. "But you don't have to be." Daniel's breath hitched. "You and me, kid," his father continued. "We're family, and family belongs together." Daniel felt his whole body shake. He wanted to run. He needed to run. But his father was blocking the only way out. The man took another step forward. And then, he smiled. And Daniel realized something. Something that made his stomach twist into knots. His father wasn't angry. He wasn't rushing. Because he knew. He knew Daniel had nowhere left to go. Daniel's breath came in short, shaky gasps. His father stood in front of him, tall and shadowy under the dim streetlight. His black boots barely made a sound as he took another slow step forward. "There's nowhere to run, kid," he said smoothly. "Why don't you just come with me? Let's make this easy." Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. He clutched Rory tight, his sweaty fingers gripping the stuffed lion's mane. "Think, Daniel, think." He knew he couldn't outrun him. His father was taller, faster, stronger. But maybe he could outsmart him. Daniel licked his dry lips. "Why do you want me?" he whispered. His father tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes gleaming under the streetlight. "You're my son," he said simply. "I've been looking for you for a long time." Daniel swallowed. "Then why didn't you come before?" His father smiled. But it wasn't a nice smile. It was cold, calculated. "Your mother didn't make that easy." Daniel's stomach twisted. She ran from him, just like Daniel had run from Annie Joe's house tonight. And now, just like her, he had nowhere left to go. The car behind his father was still running, the back door open, waiting for him. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. No, he wasn't going to let this happen. He had to do something. Anything. Daniel's mind raced. There had to be a way out. He forced himself to look around, searching for something, anything that could help him. A street sign, a trash can, a cracked sidewalk, and then a bus. Coming down the street. His chest tightened. It wasn't stopping, but it was fast. If he could just... Daniel's father took another step forward. "Enough games, Daniel," he said. "Come on." Now, Daniel bolted. Not away. Forward. Straight toward his father. For a split second, the man's face twisted in surprise. He hadn't expected that. And in that split second, Daniel dropped to the ground and slid between his legs. His father lunged, too slow. Daniel scrambled to his feet and ran straight into the street. The bus was almost there. He heard his father's footsteps pounding behind him. Daniel didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't think. He jumped. The bus whooshed past, horn blaring, tires screeching. Daniel felt the air rush around him as he dove, rolling onto the sidewalk on the other side. Pain shot through his arm, but he didn't stop. He scrambled up, panting, and turned. His father stood frozen on the other side of the street, his eyes burning with anger. The bus had cut him off. For now, Daniel took one shaky step backward, then another. Then, he ran. Daniel didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to keep moving. His legs ached, his feet hurt, his lungs burned. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Not until he was safe. But where was safe? His mother was in jail. Auntie Joe's house wasn't safe anymore. Not if his father knew where he lived. The police? No. They hadn't helped his mom. And deep down, Daniel didn't trust them. He needed a place to think, to hide. Then, through the blur of streetlights and cars, he saw something familiar. A diner. Not just any diner. His mother's diner. Daniel's chest tightened. She used to bring him here when she had late shifts. He would sit in a booth with hot chocolate while she worked. No one knew him here. No one would expect him to come. It was perfect. Daniel ran across the street, his legs shaky, and pushed through the glass door. A bell jingled above his head. The smell of coffee and pancakes filled the air. A few customers sat at the counter, chatting with the waitress. No one noticed him. Good. Daniel slid into the last booth in the back, pulling his hood over his head. His hands were still shaking. His father had almost taken him. Almost. And if he had, Daniel didn't want to think about it. Instead, he curled into the seat, hugging Rory tight. He needed a plan. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. The minutes stretched on. Daniel stared at the table, lost in thought. Then, "Hey kid." A voice. Daniel froze. Slowly, he lifted his head. A waitress stood beside the table, holding a notepad. She had curly brown hair and tired eyes, but her voice was soft. "You okay?" she asked. Daniel nodded quickly, shrinking into his hoodie. The waitress frowned. "You sure?" He didn't answer. The waitress sighed. "Listen, kid, I know every face that comes in here, and I don't think you belong here alone." Daniel's stomach twisted. "I won't call anyone," she said, lowering her voice. "But if you need help, just say the word." Daniel bit his lip. He did need help, but could he trust her? Before he could answer, the bell over the door jingled. A man walked in, tall, dark clothes. Daniel's blood ran cold. No, it wasn't his father, but it was someone else he recognized. Victor's brother. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. Why was he here? Had his father sent him? The waitress glanced over her shoulder, following Daniel's gaze. Her body tensed, like she knew the man wasn't safe. She turned back to Daniel, her voice urgent now. "Kid," she whispered, "tell me the truth. Are you in trouble?" Daniel's chest tightened. He looked up at her. And finally, he whispered, "Yes." The waitress didn't hesitate. "Stay put," she whispered. Then she turned on her heel and walked away, heading straight toward the man at the front of the diner. Daniel's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. Victor's brother. He didn't know much about him. Only that Victor had mentioned him once, back when he first moved into their apartment. "My brother always said I was too soft. Said I let people walk all over me. But I showed him, didn't I?" Daniel hadn't understood what Victor meant back then. But now, seeing the man standing at the entrance of the diner, he knew. Victor's brother wasn't here by accident. He was looking for him. Daniel shrank lower in the booth, pulling his hood over his head. He needed to get out. Now, the waitress approached the man, her notepad tucked under her arm. "Table for one?" she asked, her voice calm and casual. The man scanned the diner, his sharp eyes sweeping over the customers. He shook his head. "I'm looking for someone." The waitress raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" The man nodded. "Little kid, dark hair, 7 years old." Daniel's stomach twisted. The waitress didn't even glance back at him. "Haven't seen anyone like that," she said smoothly. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't believe her. Daniel held his breath as Victor's brother took a slow step forward, his boots heavy against the tile floor. "You sure about that?" he asked. The waitress crossed her arms. "You a cop?" The man smirked. Something like that. The waitress didn't move. Well, if you ain't a cop, then I suggest you take your questions somewhere else. This is a family place, and we don't take kindly to strange men looking for kids. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He could feel the tension in the air. Victor's brother wasn't going to leave. Not without looking around first. And the second he saw Daniel, run. The thought shot through his mind like lightning. He had to move. Now, Daniel slipped out of the booth, staying low. The back exit. There had to be one. He scurried behind the counter, heart racing. Just as he reached the kitchen door. Hey, you. Daniel froze. The man had seen him. Panic surged through his chest. He bolted. Daniel burst into the kitchen, nearly slipping on the tiled floor. Hey, kid. A cook shouted, startled. Daniel didn't stop. He spotted a back door near the storage shelves. Almost there. The door slammed open. Victor's brother stormed inside. There you are, he said. Daniel skidded to a halt. Trapped. His heart pounded. Victor's brother took a slow step forward, blocking the exit. You're making this harder than it needs to be, kid, he said. Your dad just wants to see you. That's all. Daniel's fists clenched. Liar. His father didn't just want to see him. If he did, he wouldn't have tried to grab him, wouldn't have chased him, wouldn't have sent someone after him. Daniel swallowed hard. I don't want to go. Victor's brother sighed. It's not up to you. He took another step forward, and that's when the waitress appeared behind him, with a frying pan. Crack. The metal slammed against the back of the man's head. He stumbled. Daniel gasped. The waitress grabbed his arm. Move, kid. Daniel didn't think. He ran. The alley behind the diner was dark and smelled like old garbage. Daniel's legs ached, but he didn't stop running. The waitress ran beside him, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. After 2 blocks, she finally yanked him into a side street, pressing him against a brick wall. Okay, she panted. I need to know what the heck is going on. Daniel was still shaking. He didn't know what to say. How could he explain all of it? The trial, his mother, his father. The waitress crouched down, gripping his shoulders. Kid, listen to me, she said, her voice serious now. You're in danger, aren't you? Daniel nodded. The waitress cursed under her breath. And I just smacked some guy with a frying pan for you. So I'm guessing I'm in danger now too. Daniel swallowed hard. I didn't mean to. The waitress shook her head. Forget that. We need to get you somewhere safe. Safe. But where? Daniel looked around, panic creeping into his chest again. If Victor's brother had found him here, he could find him anywhere. The police? No. Auntie Joe? No. Then, a thought hit him. He knew where to go. Somewhere no one would look for him. Somewhere no one knew about. Except for one person. His mother. Lisa had told him a long time ago, back when he was little. If anything bad ever happens, if we ever need to disappear, there's a place we can go. Daniel looked up at the waitress, his hands still shaking. I think I know where to go, he said. The waitress studied him, then nodded. Okay, kid. Lead the way. But before they could move, a car screeched to a stop at the end of the alley. Headlights flooded the narrow space. Daniel's stomach dropped. A figure stepped out of the car. Tall, dark. His father. A slow, amused smile spread across his face. Well, well, he said softly. You've been a very bad boy, Daniel. Daniel's whole body froze. His father took a slow step forward. No more running. Daniel's whole body locked up. The alley was too narrow. The walls on either side were too high to climb. And the only way out was past his father. The waitress grabbed his hand. Kid, she whispered. When I say go, you run. Daniel swallowed hard. But, no buts, she said sharply. Trust me. His father took another step forward. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice eerily calm. I'm your father. I just want to take you home. Daniel clenched his jaw. Liar. His father's smirk twitched. That's not very nice. The waitress tightened her grip on Daniel's hand. You need to leave, buddy, she said to his father. Before this gets messy. His father laughed. Low, cold, like the idea was ridiculous. You think you can stop me? He said. The waitress didn't blink. She lunged. A glass bottle appeared in her hand. Daniel didn't even know where she got it from, and she smashed it on the ground. Sharp, jagged edges gleamed in the dim light. She pointed it straight at his father. "Try me." Daniel's heart almost stopped. His father's smirk disappeared. A pause. Then, he sighed, shaking his head like he was disappointed. "I didn't want to do this the hard way," he said. A car door slammed. Daniel's stomach dropped. Two other men stepped out of the car. They were big, broad shoulders, dark clothes, serious faces. Not good. Not good at all. The waitress stiffened. "Kid," she whispered. "Run." Daniel turned to bolt, but one of the men grabbed him. "Let me go." He kicked. He screamed. He thrashed as hard as he could, but the man's grip was like steel. His father sighed. "This is why I don't like working with children," he muttered. The waitress charged. She swung the broken bottle, aiming for the man holding Daniel, but his father moved fast. Too fast. He grabbed the waitress's wrist and twisted. She let out a sharp cry, the bottle slipping from her hand. She tried to break free, but the second man grabbed her from behind, pinning her arms. Daniel's chest tightened. "No." His father took a slow step forward. He crouched down in front of Daniel, placing a finger under his chin. Daniel tried to yank away, but the man holding him didn't let go. His father smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "See?" he said softly. "Now we're done playing games." Daniel's whole body shook. No, 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 no. This wasn't happening. "Let her go," Daniel choked out. "She didn't do anything." His father raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what about you?" Daniel clenched his jaw. "I don't want to go with you." His father sighed. "I don't think you understand. You don't have a choice." Daniel's chest felt like it was crushing in on itself. He looked at the waitress. She was still struggling, but the man behind her was too strong. She met his gaze. Something passed between them. A look. A silent message. Then, she moved. Fast. She stomped down on the man's foot hard. The man yelped. In that split second, she twisted free. Daniel acted. He bit down on the arm of the man holding him. Hard. The man yelled. His grip loosened. Daniel yanked away. "Run!" the waitress shouted. Daniel ran. His legs burned. His lungs ached. But he didn't stop. The waitress ran beside him. Faster. Faster. Behind them, his father roared in anger. "Get them!" Footsteps thundered behind them. Daniel's chest felt tight. They were gaining. He turned a corner, almost slipping on the pavement, his heart pounding in his ears. They needed to hide. But where? Up ahead. A subway entrance. His stomach twisted. It was their only chance. "Down there!" he shouted. The waitress didn't hesitate. They raced down the steps, two at a time, Daniel's sneakers slapping against the concrete. His breath came in sharp gasps as they reached the platform. A train was approaching. Doors open. Almost. Almost. They jumped in. The doors slammed shut. Just in time. Daniel and the waitress collapsed onto the seats, gasping for breath. The train moved. Slowly. Then faster. The station disappeared behind them. Daniel's whole body shook. That was too close. He turned to the waitress. "Are you okay?" She laughed. A short, breathless, wild laugh. "Kid," she said, shaking her head, "I just went up against 3 grown men and a psycho dad. I don't think I've been okay all night." Daniel almost smiled. Almost. Because the truth was, they weren't safe yet. His father wasn't going to give up. He'd keep coming. And next time? Next time, they might not get away. The waitress sighed, rubbing her wrist. "So, kid," she said, "where exactly are we going?" Daniel swallowed hard. Then, quietly, he answered, "My mom's safe house." The waitress raised an eyebrow. "Your mom had a safe house?" Daniel nodded. "She always said, if something bad ever happened, and we needed to disappear." He met the waitress's eyes. "That's where we go." The waitress let out a deep breath. "Well," she said, leaning back in her seat. "Lead the way, kid." Daniel turned toward the window, watching the city blur past. They had escaped. For now. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not even close. The subway ride felt endless. Daniel sat curled up in his seat, gripping Rory tightly. His heart was still hammering, his hands still shaking. He had escaped, but his father wasn't the kind of man to just give up. He'd come looking for him again, and next time, Daniel might not be so lucky. The waitress, who still hadn't told him her name, let out a long breath, rubbing her forehead. "So, kid," she said finally, "you want to tell me where this safe house is?" Daniel hesitated. He wasn't supposed to tell anyone. His mother had always said it was their biggest secret. But if he wanted to get there, he needed help. And right now, this waitress was the only person in the world who seemed to be on his side. He looked up at her. "It's outside the city," he said. "In the woods. My mom told me about it when I was little. She said if we ever had to disappear, that's where we'd go." The waitress frowned. "And you know how to get there?" Daniel nodded. "Kind of." She sighed. "Well, that's better than nothing." She leaned back, running a hand through her messy curls. "Guess that means we need a way out of the city." Daniel swallowed. "Yeah." They both fell silent, the dim subway lights flickering above them. Then, suddenly, the train slowed down. Daniel frowned. "What's happening?" The waitress sat up straighter, looking out the window. "We're not supposed to stop here." The train shuddered to a halt. The lights flickered. Daniel's stomach twisted. Something felt wrong. The doors hissed open. For a moment, just a moment, nothing happened. Then, heavy footsteps. Multiple. Coming from the far end of the subway car. Daniel's blood ran cold. The waitress cursed under her breath. "Not again." Daniel turned. Down the aisle, stepping onto the train, were two men. Not his father, but his father's men. Daniel's pulse pounded. His father must have figured out where they were going, and he had sent these men to finish the job. One of the men scanned the car. His eyes landed on Daniel, and he smiled. "There you are, kid." Daniel's breath caught. The waitress muttered, "I really should have stayed at work tonight." Then, she grabbed Daniel's hand. "Run." They bolted out of the subway car, pushing past confused passengers. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. They raced up the stairs, two at a time, bursting into the cold night air. The station was nearly empty, the streets wet from rain. The waitress yanked him into a dark alley. Footsteps pounded behind them. The men were chasing them. Daniel gasped for breath. "What do we do?" The waitress didn't answer. She glanced around, eyes darting, thinking. Then, she spotted something. A motorcycle, parked by a dumpster. Keys still in the ignition. Daniel's eyes widened. "No way." The waitress grinned. "Time for a crash course in Grand Theft Auto, kid." Daniel had never been on a motorcycle before, and now, as he clung to the waitress's waist, he was pretty sure he never wanted to be on one again. The bike roared as they sped down the street, wind slapping against his face. Behind them, the two men ran after them, but they were too slow, too late. The waitress let out a breathless laugh. "We are so going to jail for this." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. "Just don't crash." She swerved around a corner, the tires screeching. No promises. Daniel's hands ached from holding on so tightly. But when he glanced back, the men were gone. They had lost them. For now, they rode for over an hour, heading out of the city. The buildings turned into gas stations. Gas stations turned into long, winding roads. And finally, the roads turned into woods. Tall trees loomed over them as they drove deeper and deeper into the forest. Daniel's heart pounded. They were almost there. Almost safe. Finally, the waitress pulled the motorcycle to a stop. The forest was silent. Dark. Daniel slid off the bike, his legs shaky. The waitress killed the engine. She let out a long breath. "Okay, kid." She turned to him. "Where now?" Daniel swallowed. He looked around, the shadows shifting in the trees. Then, slowly, he pointed. "There." A narrow dirt path, almost hidden between the thick trees. The waitress nodded. "All right." She stretched, groaning. "I swear, if your mom doesn't have coffee at this safe house, I'm walking back to the city." Daniel almost smiled. Almost. They started walking. The path was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel's pulse wouldn't slow down. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, The waitress froze. Daniel's heart jumped. What? She didn't answer, just stared ahead. Daniel followed her gaze, and his stomach dropped. The safe house. It was already open, the door unlocked, and someone was inside. A shadow moved behind the window. A man, waiting for them. Daniel's hands shook. The waitress whispered, "I think we just walked into a trap." Daniel's blood ran cold. The safe house was supposed to be safe, but someone was inside, waiting, watching. The waitress took a slow step back, her body tense. "Kid," she whispered, "we need to get out of here." Daniel's stomach twisted. His hands clutched Rory tightly. But what if it's my mom?" The waitress hesitated. Then, the front door creaked open. A shadow stepped onto the porch. A man, tall, dark jacket, sharp face. Not his father, but someone just as bad. Victor's brother. Daniel's heart stopped. The waitress cursed under her breath. "You have got to be kidding me." Victor's brother leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Well, he said. "Look who finally showed up." Daniel's chest tightened. It was a trap. His mother's safe house had been compromised. Victor's brother had been waiting for them. The waitress took another step back, slowly positioning herself in front of Daniel. "How about you move out of the way and let us go?" she said. Victor's brother laughed. Low, dark. "Oh, sweetheart," he said. "You're not going anywhere." Then, the bushes rustled. Daniel spun around. 2 more men stepped out from the trees, trapping them. Daniel's stomach dropped. They were surrounded. The waitress's fingers twitched. Daniel could tell. She was about to make a move. But Victor's brother was ready. "Don't even think about it," he said. "You've caused enough trouble tonight." His eyes locked onto Daniel. "And you?" He shook his head. "Your father's getting real tired of chasing you around, kid." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. His voice came out small. "I don't want to go with him." Victor's brother smirked. "Yeah? That's not really your decision, is it?" The waitress took a step forward. "You're not taking him." Victor's brother chuckled. "Lady, you got lucky last time." He tilted his head. "No frying pans here. No surprise attacks." The waitress narrowed her eyes. Victor's brother sighed. "Listen, I don't want to kill you. But if you make me..." He pulled a gun from his jacket. Daniel froze. His chest felt like it was going to cave in. A gun. A real gun. The waitress stiffened. Victor's brother sighed. "Smart people don't fight a loaded weapon. So do yourself a favor." He gestured toward the porch. "Get inside." Daniel's mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The waitress took a deep breath. "All right." She raised her hands slowly. Daniel's eyes widened. "No." She gave him a look that said, "Trust me." Slowly, she took a step forward, then another. Victor's brother smiled. "That's more like it." He turned slightly, just for a second, toward the 2 men behind Daniel, and in that second, the waitress moved. Everything happened fast. She lunged, grabbing Victor's brother's wrist. The gun went off, bang. Daniel flinched. The waitress twisted his arm, forcing the gun downward. Another bang. The bullet hit the ground. Victor's brother shouted. The waitress kicked him. Hard. He stumbled back. "Run, kid," she yelled. Daniel ran. His legs burned. His lungs ached. Branches scraped his arms as he tore through the woods. He didn't know where he was going. He just had to get away. Voices shouted behind him. Footsteps pounded against the dirt. They were chasing him. Daniel's chest tightened. Faster. Faster. The trees blurred past. His feet slammed against the ground. Then, a hand grabbed his hoodie. Daniel screamed. He thrashed, kicked, twisted, but the grip was too strong. Then, a deeper voice. "Enough." The blood drained from Daniel's face. He knew that voice. Slowly, he turned. His father, standing right there. Daniel's stomach twisted. "No, no, no." His father shook his head. "I told you," he said, his voice eerily calm. "No more running." Daniel tried to pull away. His father's grip tightened. "Sure," he said. "You're coming with me." Daniel struggled. "No. Let me go." His father sighed. I really hoped you wouldn't make this difficult. Then, his free hand moved. Something sharp pricked Daniel's arm. A needle. His whole body went cold. His vision blurred. His father's voice echoed in his ears. There we go. That's better. Daniel's legs wobbled. His head felt heavy. His eyelids drooped. The last thing he saw was his father's smile. Then, everything went black. Darkness. Heavy. Endless. Daniel drifted in it, like floating underwater, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then, a voice. Far away. Wake up, kid. Daniel's eyelids felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. His body was sluggish, slow. His arms, his legs, they wouldn't work. Where am I? The world around him was a blur, shapes shifting in and out of focus. Then, light. His vision cleared just enough to see a room. Small, dim cold, metal walls, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, a chair, a desk, and his father, sitting across from him, watching, waiting. Daniel's heart pounded. He tried to move. His hands wouldn't budge. He looked down. Ropes, tied around his wrists, tied to the chair. Panic rushed through him like wildfire. No, no, no. His father sighed. There you are, he said, leaning forward. I was starting to think I gave you too much. Daniel's stomach twisted. The needle. His father had drugged him. That's why everything felt so slow. His father tilted his head. You shouldn't have run from me, Daniel. Daniel clenched his fists, struggling against the ropes. Let me go. His father chuckled. Let you go? He shook his head. I spent years looking for you. You really think I'm just going to let you walk away? Daniel's jaw tightened. I don't belong to you. His father sighed. That's where you're wrong, kid. You're mine. Daniel's stomach churned. He didn't belong to him. He never had. His father stood up, slowly pacing the room. You have no idea how much trouble your mother caused me, he muttered. Hiding you, keeping you from me, making me waste all this time tracking you down. Daniel's chest tightened. His father stopped pacing. He turned, his dark eyes locking onto Daniel's. I should have found you sooner, he said. But no matter. You're here now. Daniel swallowed. What do you want? His father smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. I'm giving you a choice, son, he said. Daniel stiffened. Choice? His father crouched down, his face inches from Daniel's. You can stay with me, he said. Be my son. Let me teach you how the world really works. Daniel's skin crawled. His father's hand landed on his shoulder, firm, heavy. Or, his father continued, you can refuse. His fingers tightened. And I promise you, if you refuse, things will get very unpleasant. Daniel's stomach churned. His father was testing him, trying to break him, trying to make him afraid. But Daniel had already been afraid. For weeks, for years. And he was done. He took a deep breath, lifted his chin. Then, he looked his father right in the eye. No. His father's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of amusement. Wrong answer. Then, he stood up, turned toward the door. Looks like we'll have to do this the hard way. Daniel's stomach twisted. His father knocked twice on the door. It swung open. 2 men stepped in. Big, broad shoulders, cold eyes. Daniel's breath caught. No, no, please. His father stepped aside, waving them forward. Convince him, he said. The men stepped closer. Daniel's chest tightened. This was it. No way out. No escape. And then, boom. The door exploded open. A blur of motion. Shouting. A flash of blue uniforms. A gunshot, then another. The men staggered back. Daniel's ears rang. The ropes around his wrists were suddenly being cut. Hands grabbed his shoulders. Daniel, can you hear me? Daniel blinked. A face. A woman. Detective Monroe. Daniel's breath shuddered. The police. They had found him. Monroe grabbed his arm. Come on, kid. We're getting you out of here. Daniel stumbled to his feet. His whole body shook. Behind him, his father yelled, No, that boy belongs to me. Monroe pulled Daniel toward the door. Like hell he does. His father lunged. A loud crack. He collapsed. A police officer stood behind him, gun still raised. Monroe yanked Daniel forward. "Move, kid. We're clear." Daniel didn't hesitate, didn't look back. He ran. The next few hours were a blur. Police cars, flashing lights, detectives talking in hushed voices. Daniel sat wrapped in a blanket, his hands still shaking. He was free. It didn't feel real. Then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. "Baby?" Daniel's head snapped up. His mother. Lisa stood there, tears running down her face. Daniel let out a broken sob. "Mama!" She ran to him, wrapping him in the tightest hug. Daniel clung to her, his whole body shaking. She kissed his forehead, his hair, his cheeks. "My baby," she whispered, voice cracking. "My sweet, brave boy." Daniel buried his face in her shoulder. For the first time in weeks, he felt safe. Days later, Daniel sat in a courtroom, watching his father being led away in handcuffs. Convicted, locked away, gone, forever. Lisa held his hand tightly. "It's over, baby," she whispered. Daniel squeezed her fingers. He knew his life wouldn't go back to normal. Too much had happened. Too much had changed. But as he looked up at his mother, at the relief in her eyes, at the love in her smile, he knew one thing for sure. He was finally free, and no one would ever take him away from her again.